Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Pink Cloud Frequency. I am your host, Brianna Wynn. Today, we are going to discuss why alcohol is so hard to walk away from. Because if drinking had been awful every single time, you would have quit years ago. If every night ended in disaster or every morning came with unbearable sickness and shame, you wouldn't still be negotiating with alcohol. But that's not what happens, right? Some nights are really fun. Some mornings do feel manageable. And that inconsistency is exactly what keeps you stuck. So we're going to break down the psychology behind why quitting alcohol can take so long, and it has nothing to do with weakness or lack of willpower. Make sure you stay for the full episode because at the end, I'm going to give you a simple 3-question test you can use when you're tempted to drink. So if you tuned in for my last episode, being the first in your circle to go alcohol-free, I briefly mentioned that awful experience when you're so hungover that you're vomiting and going to the bathroom at the same time. Now, if something like that happened after every single time you drank, you would have quit by now, right? Of course. You wouldn't still be considering whether or not alcohol added any value to your life. If you were extremely sick or if you did do something you regret every single time you drank. But that's not the case. Some nights do feel great and some mornings do feel productive even when you drank an excessive amount. So why do those good nights keep you stuck longer than the bad ones? It's because of a concept called intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement happens when a reward is given sometimes, but not every time. And that unpredictability makes the behavior more addictive, not less. This concept comes from behavioral psychology and the work of B.F. Skinner. So he found that behaviors rewarded on a variable schedule are the hardest to extinguish. So if you haven't heard of his Skinner box experiment, he experimented on rats and pigeons. And the animals would press a lever inside of the box. Now, at first, the animals pressed the lever randomly. But once they realized that food followed, they began to press it more often. So the reward, which was the food, strengthened the behavior, which was pushing the lever. So Skinner tested different reinforcement schedules, a fixed ratio, which is a certain number of presses, a fixed interval schedule, so he would give them a reward after a set amount of time, a variable interval, a reward after varying time intervals, and a variable ratio, a reward after an unpredictable number of presses. So maybe the animals got food after 2 presses, sometimes after 15, sometimes after 7. What Skinner's experiment found was that the animals pressed the lever obsessively even when the reward became rare. Why? Because maybe the next time they would get the food, right? The results of his experiment demonstrate that variable ratio schedules produce the highest and most persistent rates of responding. So think of a slot machine or any type of gambling. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but there's no reliable schedule. Or a toxic dynamic, maybe an ex-partner or a parent or a coworker. Sometimes they appear sweet and genuine. Other times they can be rude and condescending, or even social media notifications, right? The reward hasn't come yet, but you keep buying scratch tickets or you keep pulling the lever on that slot machine. You keep checking your social media account for notifications. You stay in that toxic dynamic. Why? Because the brain doesn't get hooked on certainty, it gets hooked on possibility. So your brain thinks maybe you will win money this time. Maybe your coworker will be nice today. Maybe there will be a Facebook or Instagram message. Because let's say you buy a $20 scratch ticket every Friday after you get paid. One Friday you win $100, so you're ecstatic. But then imagine it takes you another 20 weeks before you win another $100. Does it make sense to keep buying them? Of course not. If your coworker was rude and condescending to you every single interaction, are you going to continue initiating contact with them? No. You're going to try to find another way to get the job done without having to communicate with them. And it's the same for alcohol. If alcohol made you feel terrible every single time you drank, the behavior would extinguish quickly. But your brain uses a variable reward schedule to condition you to keep participating in that behavior. So when you drink alcohol, your brain relies on that unpredictability, on the possibility of it being a good night. So some nights you go out, you drink, you feel fun or flirty and playful. You feel connected. You feel that stress relief. You dance, you bond, you laugh. But then what about the nights that you overshare or you get in a verbal altercation? What about the nights where you black out? You don't remember half of your night. What about the nights you wake up and you feel ashamed? You never know which one you'll get. You're not sure if this time you pick up the drink, you'll be rewarded with a fun, lighthearted night, or if it's going to be a night that turns into a blackout. And let's say the past 3 times you drank, you did black out. Your brain is still going to push that lever, so to speak, in an attempt to get its next reward of a good night. The unpredictability of which type of night you're going to have, it strengthens that loop. So some mornings even, you feel fine. You didn't drink that much. See, you can handle your liquor. But then what about the mornings where your heart is racing, you have anxiety, your head is aching, you're dehydrated, your face is swollen, your eyes are bloodshot, you feel bloated, you're experiencing waves of guilt and shame? That dissonance between the good mornings and the unpleasant mornings, that keeps the hope alive for the next good morning, right? Have you ever noticed that after a really bad hangover, when you swear to yourself you won't drink again, yet within that same week you're picking up another drink? That's not because you're weak-minded. It's your brain trying to override that negative feedback. Your brain is activated by the anticipation of the next possible rewarding outcome. Your brain's not motivated by the drink itself. Even if that night that you have doesn't unfold the way you're anticipating, you never know when that next reward, that next good night is coming, so you keep drinking. And this is supported by dopamine levels in your brain. Unpredictable rewards actually stimulate more anticipatory dopamine release than predictable ones. So think about a time when you've planned a big vacation. You spend months figuring out the nicest resort. You pick out the best restaurants. You choose the activities you'll do, all the daily excursions. You shop for outfits, for swimsuits, for shoes. You organize your schedule. You take the time off work. You have the dog sitter in place. Everything's planned to the T. You're excited. You feel good. You tell your friends about it. You can't wait for the trip. Only for you to arrive and the 5-star resort feels more like a 3-star. Were those restaurant reviews paid for because the food is terrible? The excursions you booked weren't as fun as they looked in the videos. There's long lines everywhere you go. Nothing feels quite as good as you anticipated because your dopamine spikes more in anticipation than in the actual reward. Your brain remembers the potential, not the outcome. So the experience itself doesn't have to be subpar, but the potential of what it could have been doesn't match up with what was. So sometimes all that planning, all that getting ready, all that feels better than the drinking itself. My son recently had a birthday, and this is one of the first years he didn't have a big party because he did driver's ed during his vacation. And nonetheless, I was reflecting back on how stressful some of those parties were when he was younger. Because at that young age, when they're in elementary school, you send invites to the entire classroom. So you have a party with no less than 20, 25 little kids running around screaming. There's messes everywhere. There's food everywhere. And yes, that can be exciting, but it's stressful. Whether it's good stress or bad stress, it's still stress on your body. So you're counting down until it's over because you're waiting for that glass of wine. That anticipation of that sense of relief after all the chaos you're going through at the party, that can feel better than the actual drink, right? Or let's say, you do plan a drink out with a friend after that birthday party and you anticipate a night of good food, good drinks, laughing, music, maybe dancing. So you find a cute outfit, cute shoes, all to get where you're going. And then you feel like, is this it? Why did I get dolled up for this? And usually, if you're already out and you put in all that effort, you don't turn around and go home, do you? No, you keep drinking until the night is everything you wanted it to be. And then you get carried away. And when those nights do happen, when you do get carried away and maybe do drink a little bit too much, you rationalize. You were stressed, so you drank more than usual. You didn't eat enough. You only had a granola bar for breakfast and, a couple of bites of salad or one slice of pizza at your kid's birthday party. You didn't eat anything else. Or it was that friend you went out with. You always get carried away when you go out with that friend. You protect the belief that alcohol is good. You make up any reason why it was you, what you ate, what you didn't eat, the situation, your emotions. It's never the alcohol. I mean, seriously, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard a woman say she thinks she got roofied. I've said it myself before, actually. And sure, there's plausibility, but the more reasonable explanation is that we got drunker than we were used to, and we don't want to admit it. And don't get me wrong, because there are date rape drugs on the market and not everyone has good intentions. So my intent isn't to minimize anyone's experience who has gone through this. My point is to demonstrate the lengths that will go to defend alcohol or to convince everyone else that the behavior couldn't have been from alcohol. Because we have this belief in society that our behavior, stemming from reduced inhibitions, reduced reasoning, reduced judgment, that's not a consequence of the alcohol. It's somehow a personal defect. It's a flaw if anyone demonstrates any type of unruly behavior. So we make up any excuse we can to distance our alcohol intake from the effects and to continue drinking. And more importantly, to continue drinking without being challenged or confronted. Because if you're out and someone says to you, I don't think you should have those limoncello shots tonight. Remember what happened the last time you had all those limoncello shots? And they're like, oh, no, I was roofied that night, remember? And this is what you do Not necessarily consciously or intentionally, but this is what your brain is doing behind the scenes because your brain wants to keep alcohol as the main character in your life. So it will reason and rationalize any which way it can for that to happen. There's something called the peak end rule. It's a cognitive memory bias where you judge an experience largely based on its most intense point, the peak point, and then on its conclusion, the end point, rather than judging the experience on the total sum or average of the whole experience. So your brain remembers the best moment and the final moment, but your brain doesn't hold on to the 4 hours in between. So this memory shortcut disproportionately influences how you recall a night of drinking so that you're only remembering the emotional peak. So let's say you're at a bar with your girlfriends. Live music is playing, right? There's a band there. One of your favorite songs is being performed. So what do? You decide to get up, go dance with the band, you sing, you haven't danced like that in forever. You haven't sung like that in ages. You feel good. And that one great experience you have at 9:45 p.m., it outweighs the other parts of the night. You don't reflect back on the details of your personal life that you overshared when you normally wouldn't have. You don't reflect back on the moment the bartender cut you off because you were slurring your words so sloppily. You don't remember when you tripped and fell walking out the door. You don't hold on to the fact that you scribbled your phone number on a napkin for some guy. You don't remember that you argued with your friend about not wanting to leave when it was time to go. The total sum of your experience that night was actually pretty bad, but you made it home safely. And so your brain is holding on to that emotional intensity of the 5 minutes you danced and sung and the end of the night when you got home safe. Your brain's holding on to that to validate that it was in fact a good night. And that's how you're going to store that memory. Even though you might be crying at 1:30 a.m. or anxious at 3 a.m. or wide awake at 5 a.m. or feeling guilt and shame at 9 a.m. the next morning. Once you come to this realization that harmful behaviors are being reinforced intermittently, that dopamine releases in anticipation of a drink, that your brain uses shortcuts like the peak end rule to store memories, that your brain has a tendency to rationalize any self-inflicted harm, that alcohol is unpredictable by design. Once you realize all that, then you can stop being so hard on yourself for not walking away from alcohol sooner. You can stop gambling with your days because you're never going to be able to guarantee the vibe of the night if you go out for drinks. You can't guarantee the version of yourself that will show up at midnight. You can't know for certain the feeling in your body the next morning. But when you decide to go alcohol-free, you eliminate entire categories of suffering, of pain, of unpredictability. You know you won't wake up anxious from a toxin. You know you won't replay the night in dread. You won't have a headache from a poison. You won't be vomiting or have diarrhea. You won't wonder what you said or who you gave your number to. You won't have to piece together your night from text messages and call logs and clues in your car and in your house. You won't negotiate with shame. And let's say, hey, life isn't perfect. So let's say you do wake up to some really bad news or a negative life event. Just because you removed alcohol doesn't mean that you don't have adversity in your life. But when you quit drinking, you are able to face your circumstances with clarity and energy. You don't have that brain fog or irritability. You have patience and emotional stability. So you can't predict the future. You don't know what good might come from a night of drinking. But when you remove alcohol, you know the bad that won't come. And as an adult, as you get older, that's far more significant. You move from variable chaos to emotional stability. Your brain shifts from that neurological conditioning, from that unpredictability, from that hope. Your brain shifts to certainty. And that certainty is freedom. When you live alcohol-free, your sleep becomes predictable. Your mornings become grounded. Your self-trust is intact. You have clarity. Your emotional baseline stabilizes. Your confidence is real and reliable. Your energy is unstoppable. You feel purposeful. You're able to check everything off your to-do list. You can spend quality time with your children. Actual meaningful time engaging with them, being present with them, listening. You can work on those meaningful projects and use your creativity in the ways you've always wanted to. You invest that time back into yourself. All that time you spent gambling on nights, seeing if they were going to be a good night or not, all that time you spent drinking and hungover, you use that time for your health and your self-care and your personal goals. You're willing to trade a night that might be good for a tomorrow that will be clear. So this is where the simple 3-question test I mentioned at the beginning of the episode comes into play. You can use this when you're tempted to drink. It's the certainty test. Question 1. If tonight were guaranteed to end badly, would you still go? Question 2. If tomorrow morning were guaranteed to feel anxious, would you still drink? And question 3, why are you gambling when you already know the odds? Ask yourself those 3 questions before you head out for a night of cocktails. Because the certainty you get, nothing is certain in life, right? We know that. Except death, right? That is the only certainty. So we know nothing is certain. But we become more certain when we cut out the uncertainty. Freedom begins the moment you stop negotiating with that uncertainty. Freedom is having a clear mind and the capacity to think for yourself, to be able to make choices that are your own, to be able to live a life of your own design, not someone else's, not a substance's. So for your reflection, if you are still drinking, is alcohol worth the odds? And if you've quit, congratulations. But if you've quit and you're no longer drinking, what if you gained from the certainty of an alcohol-free life? So if this episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it with a friend who may want to hear it. As always, thank you so much for listening.